Welcome to the Seattle Design Festival Thriving Cities Design Discussion. I'm Adrian Lum with MG2, a local architectural office here. And I'm also a board member of Design in Public. And I am very excited to be introducing to tonight's event. So, as many of you know, the Seattle Design Festival is an annual event, and this is our 9th year. So if you've been pleased with what we've been doing to date, you can just expect something pretty special on our 10th anniversary. This particular event is actually partially funded by a Neighborhood Matching Fund award from the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods. And I would like to point out our sponsors today, Gensler and the AIA Design and Wellbeing Committee. So tonight's panel discussion will be focusing on how public open space can promote balance and equity within our city, exploring how designers can support holistic and systematic solutions. I would like to now introduce you to our moderator, Joel Ferris from Gensler. He leads the research and strategy for the firm. A very exciting job. And he'll introduce the panelists and begin the panel discussion.
Tonight is a conversation about the equilibrium of place and how we think about balance and what that means for equity and what that means for belonging and what that means for community and what that means for our public spaces as platforms that facilitate interaction and play and entertainment and reflection and all sorts of different things. And we're hoping that tonight's dialogue provokes conviction. I know that we're, as an industry in architecture, we're trained to critique, right? We're trained to find the weak point that we can improve, and that's great, and that's why we do what we do, and that's why we're good at what we do. But my encouragement and my hope for us tonight is that we don't lean straight into critique, but we rather lean into conviction, right? We lean into reflection rather than a reactive kind of response to what we're going to see and hear. And our hope is that in walking away from this conversation, we walk away with real things that we can reflect on, that we can grow in, that we can then apply. We can go back into the office on Monday as practitioners in our particular disciplines and begin to implement, that we can change the process, we can question approaches, and we can begin to think about new ways of designing public spaces and designing place in general, right, for the people who live in our cities. So that's our hope for tonight, and we hope that you'll join us on that journey. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you to the AIA and to Design in Public and the sponsors of tonight's event, and for the volunteers that help bring this all together. I think it's going to be a great conversation. So with that, I'm going to introduce your panel tonight, and then we're going to hear their presentations. Casey James leads an interdepartmental City of Seattle initiative to create an integrated, equitable, and inspiring public space network that works to address Seattle's complex challenges of rapid growth, climate change, and environmental injustice. She and her team identify priority areas and key strategies to improve public space at the city scale, while also testing and improving these strategies by implementing projects at the neighborhood scale. They collaborate with youth and community leaders to create public spaces that tackle environmental injustice, while also celebrating and bolstering cultural and community identities. Her background is in landscape architecture and international studies, and before coming to the city, Casey designed public parks, plazas, light rail stations, and interpretive exhibits. Welcome, Casey. Laura Rose. Laura is a principal and landscape architect at Walker Macy, where she leads the design of many of the firm's public landscapes. She's been involved in projects throughout the country, including signature parks, plazas, gardens, and waterfronts, urban design and campus projects, and sites for cultural and educational buildings. Her projects foster exploration and reflection and are grounded in strong ideas and finished craft. Laura sits on several professional and academic advisory committees, and her work has been featured and recognized internationally. She holds a BA in art from Yale and an MLA from Harvard Graduate School of Design. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for being here. Gregory Davis. Gregory is a veteran neighborhood development practitioner of over 30 years and a longtime resident of Rainier Beach. Mr. Davis manages strategy for the Rainier Beach Action Coalition, the RBAC, which stewards the Rainier Beach Neighborhood Plan and is focused on neighborhood engagement and empowerment. The Rainier Beach Action Coalition operates initiatives focused on food justice, non-arrest crime intervention strategies, economic development, and the use of the power of social media to change the narrative of how people see and speak of Rainier Beach. RBAC prides itself in the fact that 50% of its workforce are young adults from the Rainier Beach neighborhood. Welcome, Mr. Davis. Ishmael Nunez. Ishmael Nunez is a Master of Urban Planning graduate from the University of Washington. Ishmael's work is informed by his graduate thesis, which highlights the value of community-driven design when creating Black-affirming public spaces. Recognizing that the history of modern urbanism has repeatedly contributed to the separation of communities of color from their spaces, he argues that it is the responsibility of design and planning professionals to reconcile the gap between rhetoric and outcomes in equitable placemaking. With a background in public health, Ishmael is passionate about building inclusive and healthy environments for shared belonging. Welcome, Ishmael. And finally, but definitely not least, Patrice Thomas. Patrice Thomas has worked in South Seattle for nearly a decade. She has had the privilege of working through supportive strategy with organizations such as Rainier Beach Action Coalition, South Communities Organizing for Racial and Regional Equity, and Southeast Effective Development. She brings a breadth of experience working with communities to build organizational and neighborhood capacity and advocacy for equitable public policies. Most recently, Patrice has joined the City of Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development, where she is helping to support the work of the Equitable Development Initiative. Welcome, Patrice. All right, we have an amazing panel. I don't know about you, but I got chills a couple times reading those bios. That's pretty awesome. All right, Ishmael, you're up, man. We're gonna start with you.
As I was saying, I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. As Joel had mentioned in the introduction, I just graduated from UW's College of Built Environments in June, and the work that I'm going to be talking about today stemmed from my graduate thesis, and it's kind of the impetus of what I'm trying to be doing professionally and moving forward. So I really see today's presentation as kind of setting the context for the panel discussion and really examining the role of the designer, and that includes planning professionals, architects, landscape architects, public policy makers, and anyone else that's really implicated in this practice of placemaking. So the background began with kind of a criticism, essentially, of the emerging value of equity in placemaking and this idea that it has to serve everyone for all. And this is a very personal topic for me, but recognize that there's the misalignment between this rhetoric of public space for all and then looking at the experience of being Black in public space. And even within that, understanding that there isn't a predetermined knowing, essentially, of what it means to do kind of culturally responsive design. So even within the Black experience, like myself, I was born in Colombia, I was raised in Canada, knowing that what's affirming to me might not be affirming to someone else, and trying to find that balance. And this work is really targeted to those that want to do and want to center equity and justice in placemaking, and recognizing that our role as designers, as professionals, as practitioners, is part of an industry and a history that has never really featured these types of narratives and these stories as represented in the work that we do. So it's understanding that there's a gap that exists, but it's a gap that we've created. So the work stems from thinking about this paradigm shift that I think needs to happen and is happening. And it focused on thinking about kind of this idea of Black geography or Black affirming public spaces as needing a shift in the way we think about how we know about our relationships with people and space and place. And the graduate thesis kind of had this balance of like academic and theory and then applied to practice. So I won't go too much into the theory tonight and stuff, and we can talk about that more later. But I really wanted to highlight this quote as far as thinking about this paradigm shift and thinking about how these geographies that have been oppressive or have been contributing to this marginalization of experience can become sites of play, pleasure, celebration, and politics when we start to think differently about how we position ourselves as designers in the work of creating these spaces. So the moment that I found as far as actual work and actual practice and when we can think about this paradigm shift, and I guess I should say, when I'm talking about paradigm shift, I'm talking about the recognition that we as a field are trying to move away from this understanding that a lot of our practice has been dominated by this whiteness-centered point of perspective of how we kind of produce space. But then we have like this liberal kind of perspective that maybe perhaps isn't going all the way and maybe perhaps isn't fully representing or serving communities as we'd want them to. And I really like this graphic a lot because it looks at just the language that is involved in kind of these different approaches when it comes to space making and place making, and recognizing that even if you have this interest to do this social justice and design in design work, that you can still fall and kind of replicate these consequences that we've seen throughout the history of our profession. So in the thesis and the work that I've kind of been developing, I kind of had these 5 lessons for practice, but I wanted to really only touch on 2 for tonight, and we can go into the other ones later if people have questions about them. But the first one is about expanding the scope of work to include the networked ways in which people live. So when we're thinking about the process of making spaces, and we're thinking about really focused practice work where perhaps we have site-specific work, you have an affordable housing project and you're a developer in putting together that project. And understanding that people in marginalized communities, and specifically we're talking here about like Black cultural experience, that affordable housing project is one part of a whole. If we as designers understand that our role can extend beyond just providing that housing and perhaps could be an advocate for what are the nearby open spaces, what are health and wellness centers nearby, like what is the context that we're attaching our work to serve the full kind of life understanding that people are living in. And the other kind of piece that I wanted to touch on was expanding and repositioning the role of the designer. So like I said, this criticism came at looking at what is the role of the designer in the process of making these spaces, and understanding that this paradigm shift is something that isn't really taught in academic training, and it's not something that's reinforced in professional training. And maybe perhaps your role as a designer is not to, I know we're maybe beyond the idea of coming in as the expert, but maybe you are the invited guest, and maybe this scenario isn't even a community meeting. Maybe it's a talent show. Maybe it's a community dinner. And you get the opportunity to expand the parameters of what you know about a community and your work by letting them share themselves in the most authentic way that they feel they need to. So in doing so, you've changed your role of the designer, and you're now learning with community as opposed to asking them what they need to teach you. And I just wanted to finish off with these examples. So something that I think is also a responsibility for us as professionals, and regardless of students, educators, practitioners, is to continue to build the canon that doesn't already exist as far as these type of processes. So these examples here, I won't go into all of them, but are examples that I find that are very rooted in this Black cultural experience to create spaces and create capacity for people to do design work and have control and ownership over their spaces that we need to kind of champion. And if we see conversations that are in the panel tonight that you feel are really stuck with you and are really important, share those in your offices, share those in your schools, and try to keep that precedent building. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those great introductions earlier, and to Ishmael for starting off that conversation so well. My name is Casey James. I'm with the city of Seattle, and I lead a program called Outside Citywide. Outside Citywide is an interdepartmental initiative that aims to create a more integrated and inspiring and complete and equitable public space network across Seattle. And through this work, we are trying to address some of the biggest challenges that this city is facing around rapid growth and climate change and environmental injustice in a way that supports our communities to thrive in place. And we're doing this work because public space is absolutely critical infrastructure for a thriving city. It's key to our communities' both mental and physical health and well-being. It's quintessential to our urban environment and ecological systems, and can provide resilient infrastructure to protect us against climate change challenges. It is key to a healthy democracy, and it provides key social, cultural, and economic benefits to our city as well. And the great thing is that Seattle's public space network is fairly uniquely robust and diverse. We have a plethora of public spaces of all different types and stripes that are provided and maintained by a really wide variety of different departments and agencies and organizations. And it's really fantastic that we have so many different people that are contributing to our system, but that can also lead to some problems. When that work is done in siloed ways across these different departments and agencies, we can sometimes have a system on the ground that can feel fragmented and hard to navigate. And not all of those spaces are currently being used to their fullest potential. And finally, our last problem is that our system isn't currently distributed equitably across our city. And so those three problems lead to Outside Citywide's vision for how we can create a more equitable and complete network moving forward. So we have a three-pronged strategy, and these three pieces all relate directly back to those three issues I just discussed. So first, we need to focus on building really strong, inviting green connections between our population centers, our shorelines, and our public spaces. We need to get the most out of what we already have. So we need to activate and program our public spaces, partner with communities to improve those spaces and make sure they're living up to their potential. And finally, we need to make strategic expansions to our system in places that are currently in need and underserved. So our team has been working to take this vision and apply it on the ground in this neighborhood of South Park. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the South Park neighborhood. It's a fantastic neighborhood in the southwest of Seattle along the Duwamish River. It's a primarily Latinx neighborhood that faces a lot of environmental justice concerns, but also has a lot of assets. There's some really strong community leaders and organizations that are doing great work, and there's a lot of social capital in that neighborhood. Back in 2014, the Seattle Parks Foundation helped the community develop this green space vision, and one of the key elements from that vision was the South Park River Walk, which addresses a community need to, a community priority to be able to have greater access to the Duwamish River. And this idea of the South Park River Walk is it's exemplary of the sort of three-pronged approach that I just discussed. So we've been working to connect some of the planned city investments by the Parks Department, the utilities, and other partners to make sure that we're creating a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And we're also working on that connective tissue. So right now we're working on a pavement painting project with the youth in South Park that will hopefully help with some of that wayfinding and connectivity, but also will expand out the usability of some of these smaller spaces like the one you see in the upper left. And so we're partnering with the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps on this. We have a cohort of fellows that have been learning a little bit about design and planning, and created 3 designs for this project that they went and presented back to their community, received some feedback, and ended up with this final design. And we were actually just out there this morning finally putting the paint to the pavement, which was really exciting. And of course, South Park is just one of many neighborhoods in Seattle that that is in need of more attention from or more attention and more investments in public space and environmental quality. So Outside Citywide has conducted a really robust analysis of which areas of the city are better and worse served by our current public space network. And we've combined that with considerations of race and social equity, health outcomes, and growth and density to create an overall priority map for new investments. You guys can explore these maps online. They're at tinyurl.com/outside-citywide. We're continuously improving them. There's places for feedback, so we'd love to hear your thoughts. But the idea behind here is that hopefully we can use these maps to start to create some of that alignment between the work of different organizations and align that work towards more equitable outcomes in the future. And of course, though, the where is just one part of the puzzle, right? And there's also the how. So I got into that a little bit, but next I'm going to pass it on to the next three panelists who are going to talk about what this looks like at the neighborhood and site scale.
Wonderful being with you. Much respect to you and your work. Again, Gregory Davis is my name. I'm a urban planner in community organizer clothing, I think, and she's an urban planner in Black Girl Rock clothing. You can kind of look at that. So we're excited to be here because, wow, the first two presentations seem to have set the stage where you kind of have some kind of conceptual ideas about what to do, and then we've got some city-born ideas, and we are on the ground. We are walking the sidewalks where young people walk, seniors walk, different cultural communities walk, and we are interested in beautifying the urban spaces, and a word that some of our young people just kind of introduced to me, intersectionality, trying to ensure that is happening in our work. So first of all, there is a Rainier Beach neighborhood plan. We do have a plan, okay? We've been asked to organize, we've organized. We've been asked to create a plan, we create a plan. We've been asked to be community-led, we're community-led. And so right now at this point, we're looking for the come up, right? We've done all the things that the city or other folks who expected a neighborhood like ours to do. And now we are looking to get this plan implemented. So we have a few slides. We know we have just a short period of time, so we're really just going to provide a little more background and look for kind of more of the content to come out of the Q&A that happens. But we just wanted to open up with this image so that you know that there is, in fact, a Rainier Beach neighborhood plan. Let me hear everyone say it. Rainier Beach neighborhood plan. Okay. All right, all right.
We are on land that originally does not belong to any one of us in here. So I just want to recognize that space. And as we're talking about the use of land in and of itself and what it has to offer and what we can do to steward it, let's keep it at top of mind. So this is our Henderson corridor. The Rainier Beach neighborhood essentially is the gateway, if not the last frontier, to South Seattle. What you see in front of you is the Henderson corridor from the now Rainier Beach Light Rail Station all the way to Lake Washington, where Beersheba Park sits. So throughout our small presentation, we're going to be talking about activation of green spaces along this corridor and the implications that has on the development that is slated for the Rainier Beach neighborhood, either those being planned by neighborhood-based organizations or those being brought down and implemented by for-profit developers.
Okay, just a little bit of background about Rainier Beach Action Coalition, or affectionately known as RBAC, and just kind of remember RBAC has your back. You got to get that little branding pitch in there, especially since we're on Seattle Channel. So one of the things that happened in 2003 where a number of organizations got together because we wanted to organize ourselves, and this is in the Rainier Beach neighborhood. Got noticed by the city of Seattle, not sure if it was the Department of Neighborhoods or Human Services Department, but they have this project where they wanted people, called a community that care. They wanted to train organizations to do asset-based community development. So we were a great opportunity for them because we had started organizing ourselves already. One of the elements of this project was to find out if young people felt connected to their schools or neighbors felt connected to their community, and we discovered that they did not. So one of the things that we set out to do was to come up with some strategies to impact that. One of the first things we did was to say, let's do a back to school bash so that we can focus on the young people, get them excited about education. So we've been doing that for the last 16 years. We've had our 16th year anniversary of the back to school bash this year. The other was town hall meetings, to have opportunities for residents of all types to come in and hear about what's going on in the neighborhood, and also to share ideas on what we can do. So all of this built up the momentum for us to be ready for this Rainier Beach Neighborhood Plan update. We do owe some appreciation to the University of Washington because they had students come into the neighborhood to do some studios. And so when we went to talk to the City Council about being one of the 3 neighborhoods out of the 37 for the Neighborhood Plan update, that really went a long way to kind of convincing them that we were ready for it. So we've been operating since 2003. You heard a little bit background on the organization now. We kind of consider ourselves stewards of the neighborhood plan. Right now, I'm kind of modifying the language that maybe we're a policy shop, because the things that we hear from young people and the neighborhood, we want that to become policy. And we've had a couple of wins over the last few years. You may have heard about the Orca card that's now available for all high school students who want it. So that came out of young people in Rainier Beach organizing. You may have heard about, yeah, thank you. You may have heard about the priority hire program that the city of Seattle has. Well, Rainier Beach was ground zero. When they demolished the community center and rebuilt it, there were no people from the neighborhood on that construction project. So we organized, and now there's a citywide priority hire ordinance that any city of Seattle capital project must have 25% of folks from under-invested in zip codes on those construction projects. So we're pretty excited about, yeah, give yourself some, give me some, give her some. So we're excited about the Key Arena project, $900 million. So we are watching that right now in our watchdog hat to see if, right now I think the goal is 166 jobs should go to folks who live in these underinvested neighborhoods, and so that's something that we're watching. So that's a little background about kind of what we do.
All right, so this is a slide that he slid in and didn't have a chance to take a look at it and tie it to content, but we're going to speak to it anyhow. So this is a snapshot that was created for the Rainier Beach neighborhood. Actually came through the Office of Economic Development, who has been a pretty close player and partner with us with our economic development priorities, whether it be jobs creation or whether it be actual built environment. And so as you can see, Rainier Beach is pretty darn diverse. I think we are still at 60 plus languages spoken. I won't read off every single demographic. The pool you see here is a snapshot from the community center that Mr. Davis just spoke about. This document is a living document. Upon the Rainier Beach Economic Development Roundtable receiving this document, we've identified some areas of opportunity because essentially, you know, someone looking for property, looking to develop in the neighborhood can pick this up and use this up as a map, if you would, with regard to opportunity. And so we want to make sure when there is literature out here in the universe representing our neighborhood, that it has appropriate points of contact, that it represents the neighborhood appropriately, but also that it's not a tool that can be used against us. So just another example of the work that, I'm speaking to Arbeck. So I'm going to keep looking at Casey and Gregory because I'm straddling both city now and community, which is great, but I don't want to get anybody in trouble. Example of a tool as far as community is concerned, that can be a double-edged sword, right? And so just to make sure that we are appropriately advocating for what it is that we need and want.
So these are some images, some design images of 3 projects that are underway in the neighborhood that we're using to activate spaces. And we're going to just kind of go just overview of each of them. Just wanted you to kind of see them all in tandem, and all of them are aligned on the Henderson Street corridor.
All right, so this is Beersheba Park. I'll be speaking specifically to this with the questions that are to come. This is our sister city park to Israel. It is at Lake Washington waterfront. It sits behind one of our high schools, one of the largest affordable housing complexes in South Seattle. It additionally is parallel to the Rainier Beach Urban Farm and Wetlands, by which we get the inspiration for our Food Innovation Center. But I think the most important piece to call out here is it also is adjacent to a boat launch and waterfront condos. So when you think about the implications of this space and the importance of it being able to stay people-centered with equitable access to that waterfront, it carries a lot of weight. So we held a year's worth of community engagement, participatory, of course, and we started out with saying, this is not a project that's just now come to light. It's a project that we have gone out for funding for before, actually, to the Department of Neighborhoods, and we lost to the urban farm, right? So it was only a matter of time before we as communities said, let's pick it back up, continue to carry the torch. We don't want to press upon community what we think should go here. Let's really let them lead this process, and this is what we ended up with. And so we are now in capital campaign, not capital campaign, I'm sorry, construction documentation creation, and we'll enter into a capital campaign in phases. So yesterday we had our grill off to celebrate the work that we've been doing, had a competition, and we're excited to center people in this project.
So these next two, everything she said applies, right? The one unique thing is that these are all located around transit-oriented venues, either the light rail station or metro transit. And these are, we're trying to create connection between these to support the food justice work that we're doing, allowing the farm stand and our public safety work to have platforms for them to be out there doing their work and interacting with the residents. We did want to just kind of provide kind of a quick list of what we identified as barriers in our work, and some of these are kind of pretty typical that you can imagine, and we'll probably be able to go to those a little more in depth. And then we wanted to share some opportunities, and I wanted to real quick kind of explain that equity plus situation. So what you might determine to be equity in that these projects are getting funded and able to be done, we consider that just doing the right thing. The equity is the plus that comes in to continue to sustain these projects. And so that's one thing that we wanted to make sure that we left with you, was what people tend to confuse with equity is just fairness and what's right. And that this plus, it doesn't have to be just money. It can be relationships. It can be many of other things. But equity is that other thing that's up there. So just wanted you to be able to grasp that concept as it relates to these projects. So thank you very much and for your patience.
I'm going to be speaking a little bit about downtown Seattle. So many of you have spoken about the neighborhoods, and I want to talk a little bit about our downtown open spaces, which are inherently shared by an incredibly diverse group of people. So right now we know that Seattle's experiencing rapid growth. We also know that people experiencing homelessness, those numbers are rising. It's really complex and it's really challenging. And we have a lot of families suddenly living downtown who weren't before. We have more people working downtown. All of this comes together to create a situation that puts a lot of pressure on what are actually very, very small open spaces in downtown Seattle. It puts pressure on us as designers as well to try to facilitate effective conversations and to try to achieve balance in all of the different voices that we're hearing in these conversations. So my firm, Walker Macy, has been working on Victor Steinbrook Park. We're working on designing improvements to that park in the heart of Pike Place Market. And I'll be speaking about this as a bit of a case study of some of these topics. The park, Victor Steinbrook Park, just for those of you who don't know, was designed in the late 70s by Victor Steinbrook and Rich Haig, and it was meant to be an extension of the social life of the market. The park today remains incredibly diverse. It's probably used and loved by some of the broadest cross-section of the Seattle community as any open space in Seattle, and that's something that remains really exciting about it. But since its construction in 1981, it's also fallen into incredible disrepair. And so that is why the Parks Department hired us to make improvements. But we didn't want to just approach the project as though it were a fix-it job or a historic restoration job, which it incidentally has to be. But we wanted it to really reach beyond those immediate goals and reflect some of the original design intent of the park. So the park's designers were actually also social activists. They wanted the park to serve everybody, but they especially wanted the park to serve disadvantaged members of our community, as the market itself does as well. The park has special importance to some people who are from our Native American communities in Seattle. And so that too is a theme that's emerged through the work and been really important to honor. We were really excited starting the project to dig into the history of the market. And I like this quote. The market is significant in the culture of the region, drawing together a broad spectrum of people from all ethnic, national, economic, and social backgrounds as a prototype of truly cosmopolitan urban life. And that historic district ordinance and that recognition of the importance of diversity was actually one of the reasons that the market was preserved and saved and not redeveloped back in the 1970s. So our work today is in the context of a rapidly changing city. It's in the context of the waterfront, market front, and it raised big questions for us about how we could adapt Victor Steinbrook Park in a way that did not seem like it was aiming to gentrify the city or displace people who use that park today and desperately need that open space and that respite today. We had a lot of conversations and got probably feedback from over 1,000 people. But some of the most meaningful conversations we had were actually with individual people in the park. We went around and spoke to as many people as we could and who were willing to speak to us as a professional design team, which can be challenging. The conversations were really meaningful in some ways because they surprised us and because they forced us as designers, who often were coming from a background of more privilege than the people we were speaking to put aside our own assumptions about what we might hear. So I spoke to this elderly man who had been experiencing homelessness for about 3 weeks in Seattle, and he told me that the thing that would make this park better for him was seeing children in it. It had nothing to do with his own individual situation. He said he wanted to hear laughter and families and kids. Some other teammates of mine spoke to people who spend time in the park, who serve as almost ambassadors for the park and tourist guides. They said, we love visitors in our city, and we would love it if we had a connection to the waterfront and to market front, and we could tell them where to go. And so those were interesting viewpoints. We acted on that feedback we got, in part because it was also supported by other members of the community and by a cross-section of people who we spoke to. We also focused on improvements that would really enhance comfort and accessibility within the confines of the historic aspect of the park. And so we were really aiming to allow more people with different needs to spend longer periods of time in the park and to feel comfortable there, whether that was because you were there with someone in a wheelchair or because you were there in a large family group and you couldn't fit at the tables that were only in groups of 4. And so this seems probably very minor relative to some of the bigger themes that the other panelists have touched on. But one thing we've realized through this project and others is that when designers design only for themselves and design sort of, chic, hip spaces where 2 able-bodied people can sit together, that is inherently excluding large numbers of our population. And finally, my own design team recognized where we needed help and where we needed to bring in other voices into the conversation. We reached out to John Paul Jones at Jones & Jones to ask him if he'd be interested in helping us reach out to a broader Native American communities and multiple communities, not just the group that tends to use the park a lot. And so it was really terrific working with Jones & Jones. And through the feedback we got in that process, we felt that we were able to honor the culture, the local culture in some deeper ways. Some of it very simple, like using more native materials and plants in the park actually came out of those conversations with some of the different native communities. We also discovered that there was a real interest in authentic, local representation of culture. Right now, there is nothing in that park that recognizes Coast Salish culture. There are more generalized and abstracted representations of Native culture. And so that we brought in those authentic representations in ways that would put people in direct contact with those elements, such as the armrests on the bench, so people would touch them and think about them. We also worked with Jones & Jones, who worked with an artist to develop these panel wraps in the pavilion that really celebrate the themes of the market and also ground the park in those cultural references. And so I think a good lesson in this project is that although it is meant to be shared public space and support the democratic ideals of the market, that doesn't mean it has to be generic. It can include these really rich and very specific cultural references that hopefully will make everybody curious, and we hope will bring people of many different backgrounds together in one space in a way that enhances those relationships. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really fantastic presentations, a lot to think about. One of the things that we talked about, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a moderated conversation, and then we're going to open up at the end. We'll have the questions available for the audience. So one of the things that we've been talking about is this idea of place as a facilitator of relationships and the dynamics that are introduced when you think about the relationships that are facilitated in particular places and within particular contexts. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how these projects have catalyzed new relationships or redefined a relationship or put a relationship into a position that it needed to be in some way, that moved it in a meaningful way. Can you speak maybe just, and this is an open panel question, to how have these projects facilitated or in some way informed a relationship?
So for us, relationship, speaking specifically to Beersheba, relationship had implication. Hi, Lamar. Relationship had implication on actual space, and by that I mean this was a park that had received some funding, so there were improvements. There were improvements to the playground at the center of the park itself, but because so let me back up and say actually the park is owned by Parks and Recreation, right? So it is not. So it's a public space, but it is not currently. It wasn't stewarded by the public. And so, but the way in which people were using the space kind of put the maintenance folks on edge. And so they removed benches, tables, places for people to gather because they were uncomfortable with the activity that was happening there. In addition, didn't want to be responsible for the maintenance. Now, parallel to that, we have a creek that runs through the park itself. It's called Mapes Creek. And so there was a daylighting project that took place for that creek, for the salmon to be able to run through. There was an art installation, all of that greatness. But again, the work that was taking place didn't intentionally center the people. So in the case of Beersheba, relationship happened to have some negative implications on the space. And so in order for us to get to the position that we are now with that project, it took us having to go in and ask the hard questions and give the hard answers as to why the park was didn't feel like it was a priority, why decisions were being made on behalf of the park without engaging the people that actually use the park every day. I'm talking people boating, fishing, gathering, weddings, birthdays, back to school bashes, everything of the like. And, you know, so a relationship can be a positive one, it could be a negative one. And for us, it's the make or break for a lot of our spatial activity in Rainier Beach.
There's a lot of relationships there that come to mind for our projects. One is the natural, who we call the natural guardians. Mm-hmm. And these are people who, when space is underdeveloped, they program it themselves. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. And so once we develop the space, what about them? Mm-hmm. We often see development as a way to clean things up, mm-hmm. Which ultimately winds up moving people out. But these are people that we consider natural guardians, and they do seek public good. They may be out there self-medicating. They may be out there not participating as positive activity as we'd like, but they're there. And so what do we do when we design and develop these spaces? We have to engage them. We have to find opportunities for them to be able to value the space as well. The one that I really wanted to talk about, though, was the relationship with our architects. And the interesting thing is, and in this case, they provided some pro bono services, and they kind of designed it up, right? But when we introduced it to contractors, they were like, y'all don't have enough budget to do this. So we had to create phases. So I think the idea of architects coming in, wanting to do community good, wanting to tap into their artistic capabilities, wanting to do something that was lasting or sustainable, wound up being a little too much for the people who had to review it and kind of make judgments on whether they were going to permit it. For instance, a city department contract monitor, or a contractor who's looking at it and saying, I don't know about this because I got a lot of other work, so I won't be able to get to this till November or December, and by that time, it's kind of a challenging time for us. So yeah, a lot of relationships. Good question.
This morning when we were out there painting the pavement, I was having this conversation with Carmen, who leads the youth corps. She's an incredible leader in the South Park neighborhood. And we were talking about how, these improvements impact the way that the youth sort of relate to and understand their neighborhood. And it, that when you sort of see, the government has not, has had a lot of historic disinvestment in that neighborhood. And when you walk through places like what's considered the Scary Trail right now, and see the litter, see that you have a highway running through your neighborhood and all these problems, it sort of leaves you with a feeling like you aren't really valued, right? And we're hoping that through these projects that the youth can develop a sense that first that this is a place for them, this is a space in which that they belong, and that they have a sense of empowerment, that they can really make an impact on their neighborhood. And also when their neighbors and their community walks through there, it's that cue to care, right? It's that somebody loves this space. Somebody put their time and creative energy into making this a beautiful place where we belong as a community.
So the project that I spoke about isn't built yet. We expect it to go into construction next spring, but one relationship or kind of type of relationship that has already come to fruition, I think, is the relationships between the design team and the people we spoke to. And so I think that one thing that Victor Steinbrook Park taught us as a team is that, many of us as designers know that standard methods of outreach are only effective to a point, and speaking to large groups of people all at once and expecting to get thoughtful feedback is, you'll get people who feel comfortable speaking in those settings. And so especially for some of us, like myself, who also am not someone who would speak up in a setting like that, being able to have those one-on-one conversations and have those anecdotes and sort of individual stories in my mind as we are designing adds a whole nother layer of meaning to the project, because it really humanizes really just humanizes all of the issues.
The question and everything that the panelists have said, and thinking about a lot of things that you said, actually, Mr. Davis, about I think about different levels of relationships and at different kind of times in which they're happening. And I'm thinking a lot about kind of your baseline fairness is not equity, and thinking about the plus, and how you can think about the relationships that will be taking place like without you as the designer involved, as far as like who are the users of the park, and then the relationship that happens with you involved with community, and then like you were saying, Laura, like amongst yourselves in design in the offices and things like that. So I think I'm just thinking about those different levels of relationships and thinking about how the ones in the parks, in the spaces, are going to be the ones that you want to be the most lasting, but they don't have to be the only ones that continue to be the most lasting. And I think that that's something that's really interesting, especially with a lot of the examples up here.
Iijima, can you speak a little bit more to the ways in which relationships help us know You used the term epistemology in your presentation, which we had a good time about yesterday. But can you unpack that a little bit and talk about the ways that we create models of our worlds through our relationships, and how maybe if we rethink that model building, we could design more effective places?
Yeah, definitely. I think we were talking about epistemology, kind of nerding out with that yesterday for a little bit, and thinking about how we can be critical of the models that already exist, and we can use kind of questions in our practice to unpack and learn and unlearn the models that we use to create new ones. And the work that I spoke to, I said that, had kind of the balance of that first theoretical kind of heady stuff up here, but really what it's about is about shifting this paradigm. And this idea of how we come to know is really rooted, again, going back to like what is our role and what is our responsibility. So I think you having those relationships and having those experiences should kind of prompt something within us to kind of tickle that responsibility of saying, well, how do I know that the way that we've been doing these things is the way that they should be? And I like using that example, saying like, if the parameters of what you know or how you know are this wide, and you keep getting feedback or experiences that fall outside of those, then I think it's worth examining that model. And I think it's worth seeing what your responsibility is into opening that up. And I think the best way to do that is through relationships. And that's why I think that in the process of doing community engagement or doing kind of participatory work, what you're doing there is not only just trying to get closer to the end of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, but you're also opening up that model and changing it for yourself in lasting ways.
In design often, and I think for design students especially, one of the things that design students are kind of pushed into the deep end of is this idea of empathy, right? And that you can't design for your customer or your user if you don't empathize and understand them. I without showing my cards, I'd love to hear your take on, is empathy sufficient for design of public place? Like, what does that look like, and how should we be thinking about, are there ways that we should operationalize empathy in the design process? Is it something that we should not consider? Like, are there better methodologies for cultivating understanding and building relationships with people that we're serving? I just love to hear you kind of riff as a panel on that approach, and what's the role of empathy as designers in doing this work?
I'll say a few thoughts about that. I think empathy is maybe 60% of the answer, but one thing that I've realized even in my own life as I've become a mother is that suddenly being a mother has changed the way I view public open space. I'm a different designer than I was 10 years ago. And so I think the real root of this has to be that we need a more diverse group of people doing the design work to start with. And we have to be doing everything we can to inviting more voices, more varied voices into the people actually leading the work, because it's hard to imagine what someone else's experience might or might not be.
For me, when you say empathy, I have a reaction to it that like it has a negative connotation, and that could just be the way in which I'm historically used to using the language. And so it's almost like, I would expect designers not to be worried about what can we do to fix a social issue, but can we be more curious about what is going on, and how can we be mindful about how our open spaces hold that, encourage it, buttress it, and live with it. I think the other thing that we get stuck on when it comes to open space, or just space in general, is this notion of it being static. And space in general is an ever-growing, living thing, right? My siblings are always on me because, they come to the house in 30 days and I've totally changed the living room around, right? Like there are things that are static, but space is supposed to move, breathe, flex with you, right? And so I think, to your point, the more that we can get more folks, both diversity, but also diversity in thought around how we look at space in general, I think the more flex we'll have with the industry.
I would say as white designers, it's easy to sometimes confuse our own cultural preferences as universal values, and that comes up a lot in public space. One example is that white folks are more likely to try to use public space by themselves or with one other person. We like to jog, walk our dogs, and so on. And if you imagine like the typical park bench, right, that's designed really to meet the needs of white folks, and I don't think people are usually thinking of it when they put in a park bench that like, oh, I'm designing something for white people here. But when you don't question your own assumptions and your own values and your own preferences, you can sometimes do that without intending to. So I think that's one really important thing, is to try to break down some of our assumptions and realize that there might be a sort of preference there that's not universal. I also think that it's, the next step there is to sort of question the way that we view expertise, right? As design and planning professionals, we kind of think that we have the answer sometimes, but a lot of the expertise on how to do this work and how to do this right is in the leadership that exists within communities. So really valuing and respecting that, I think, is.
So when I think about empathy, I'm thinking about the definition. And we know sympathy, feeling sorry for someone, empathy, putting yourself in that person's shoes, understanding the ground that they've walked on. And for us, I think empathy leads to this point about the community or whoever the users of the space knows, that they know what they need. And so we will get designs and we will say something like, okay, well, that's great looking, but at some point there's going to be an actual use of that space. And when that actual use differs from the design, then we got to adjust that space. But when we talk about that in the beginning, there's this question of expertise. But then we experience what we know to be the actual use, and that needing to ultimately set the design. I'm thinking about a story that I heard when you asked the question, and it's about a community up north in Hamilton, and it was being settled in the early 1900s, and the First Nations folks were already there, but how welcoming they tend to be. And the settlers came to them and they said, "Where should we settle?" And the elder said, "You see that mud line up there on the hills? Settle up there, nothing below there." Where do you think they settled? They settled in the floodplain. And so for the last 100 years, they got to move every year when it floods. The community knows. The community knows. So that's kind of how I track this point about empathy.
In the design space, there's a lot of talk right now about the evolution of human-centered design, right? And that we need to move things to a relationship-centered design. And I think what you're saying is you're giving us kind of the tenets of what relationship-centered design could look like and how it evolves beyond, the linear sequential process of empathy and so on and so forth. But my next question is, there was a term used, and it's a very common term, but historic preservation. And this is a question specifically for Patrice and Casey. I want to hear your perspective on this. When it comes to historic preservation, we hear restoration preservation, and often we're talking about a physical thing, right? But all physical things have unphysical meanings, intangible meaning, right? A semiotic value of sorts. And so the question then becomes, well, whose history are we preserving, right? Whose history needs to be restored? And so I would love to hear you take a few minutes on, what are your thoughts about preservation, restoration, when it comes to history, especially in a place like Seattle, where we do live on land that was not ceded, for the most part. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
For me, I struggle with the notion of at what point are we all going to concede and take a step back behind our Indigenous brothers and sisters and, take their lead. So what does that look like? One can't say. So I'll speak specifically to Rainier Beach. So behind the RBAC office and actually really surrounding the RBAC office, like a halo, there are Duwamish greenbelts, right? And so within the Rainier Beach neighborhood, there used to be Duwamish longhouses, right? The water and the water table and where it stands now is not historically where it used to be. But the natural guardians that are occupying that space, when they're out there at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, they're launching their boats, right? They're fishing for lunch and dinner. And so when you think about a space, there are some things that regardless of, despite the trauma had upon that space, the ethos and what is intended to be used for will remain because that is what comes natural to that space, right? And so I think when we think about historic preservation, facades are gorgeous, brickwork, whatever you know, the wetlands, however you want to qualify it. But I think how a space has historically been used and its implications on people and their quality of life should have heavier weight in the equation when it comes to no, you cannot remove that awning, or yes, you can remove the awning, right? That's my tidbit.
I think historic preservation is a pretty interesting concept when it comes to landscapes which are inherently dynamic. You know, so there's always a question of whose history and what exactly are we, you know, what moment in time are we trying to preserve, and what is it about that moment in time that we're trying to preserve? I think that, you know, to me, coming from a landscape architecture background, you know, I think that it's, you know, interesting when we have this really strong focus on native plants, and one question is, like, with our climate change challenges, is a question like what's native or what's going to promote biodiversity in a changing, you know, ecosystem, right? And I think that's really the questions that we need to be asking ourselves is like, you know, I think that having something that roots us in our histories, you know, in our cultural histories of our community and our environmental histories of our community, and gives us that sense of place is really important. But there's a lot of questions to be asked about how we do that.
Mr. Davis, specifically for you, I'm curious, can you unpack further the plus plus idea? I think it's very interesting. I think it'd be really helpful if you could give some examples of some ways where, you know, designers have done the right thing, but we haven't done plus plus. Or can you help us know some specific tactical ways that we can continue to do that?
Besides pro bono services.
Yes, right.
I'm thinking about, and so in this example, it extends kind of beyond the designer, but I can imagine it implicates designers. But let's say we were successful in one of these spaces being designed, that we are successful. Do the police know that we created these spaces, that young people spoke into these spaces about what they should look like, that we wanted to value the presence of our natural guardians, that we wanted to preserve, we're talking about historical preservation, the native plants that are native to this community in these spaces. And when the police drive by, do they even know? Do they even care? Have their precinct captain or their police chief connected with the director of the Department of Office and Planning Community Development to get a briefing on these public spaces that are intended to activate that area as an alternative to policing? Mm-hmm. And when they drive by, are they conscientious of the whole intent, the intersectionality of that space? So to me, the plus plus would be, okay, that communication happening within the city, and most of our projects, if not all that you've seen up here, are on public spaces. So we have to interact with the municipalities in terms of the development of them. So yeah, it is one thing getting it designed to be in first place, but then it being reflective of young people and reflective of national guardians. But how are these other entities who have these authoritative powers oriented to understand and value what that place is? To me, that's the plus plus, because usually they will drive through the neighborhood looking for bad guys. And if they happen to be on this space that was designed in this way, you know, they're just taking action. There's not another thought in their mind about, wow, well, this was designed by young people, and this was intended to be a space for this kind of activity to happen. In fact, this activity is contributing more to the reduction in crime than my policing. That's not uppermost in their mind. So to me, that's an example of a plus plus, beyond the design, beyond the intended use, but how are these powers that be thinking about it?
This is for all of you. What's the hardest learned lesson that you've learned in doing this work? How can you save the rest of us the pain of having to learn that lesson? What can we learn from you? Let's start, Laura, would you mind kicking us off?
All right, hardest learned lesson. Oh gosh. I think humility. I think that some of these projects are just infinitely humbling, especially if you're coming in with some expertise that you know is valuable. But I think that being willing to step back and slow down. We've been working on Victor Steinbrook Park for 4 years. It's less than an acre in size, and it was not cost effective, as a business to do that. But it led to a better project because it allowed for a lot of time for reflection. It allowed for a lot of time for outreach, a lot of time to sort of process some of the things that we were hearing, and also question some of the assumptions that not only that we brought, but that, say, the historic, review brought to the table, that Parks brought to the table, and sort of just allowed time. So I think I am actually a much humbler designer today than I was when that particular project began, just because of some of its complexities.
Land use and the built environment, or design of the land use and the built environment, however you want to coin it, I think is at the core of what we all know as civic engagement, right? I think it's the thing that has helped to provide the most trauma and abuse upon people. And so in that, the trust that is not there when it comes to engaging with it in a process-oriented way, it takes the time to undo that distrust, right? Because it's one thing to say, it's one thing to be like actual trained practitioners in it and say, I can do this. It's another not to be and say, I have an idea. I know, quote unquote, highest and best use, but what are the steps or mechanisms to actually make it happen? And so the coming together of the two, in my experience, starts off highly uncomfortable, but if one is able to practice some humility, just basic curiosity, I'll put a period there. Yeah.
This is a word that came to mind, and I thought I had a more provocative answer than this, but the word pace comes to mind about the hardest thing, and you talked about slowing down. But I think because when we get into these projects, one of the requirements is you got to put a work plan together, and you got to have it timed out, and you are then charged with trying to meet those milestones and those benchmarks and the time frame. But what we put in there may not be the real pace that community needs or whoever is involved in it. And so the hardest lesson is to recognize that it may not happen at the pace that we want. And when it doesn't, that does not mean failure. That just means there was a different pace that was needed to get this to work. And it's really more pronounced when we are doing projects in the public realm, because we are having to deal with bureaucracy. There is a threshold for what is considered appropriate community engagement, and even in that step piece, not everybody operates or gets engaged at the same pace. Right. I would imagine black males got a different pace than elderly white females, and in terms of understanding, in terms of getting engaged, in terms of participating and contributing. So those are just two examples of kind of the pace matter that affects things.
I'm feeling some emerging themes that I'll jump onto here. I think one of the biggest lessons learned is just, the amount of time that it takes to do the work right. We could have gone into the neighborhood and heard about the South Park Riverwalk and come and designed this fancy Wunarf, and it would have potentially just been a signal to folks that look like me that, hey, this is a great neighborhood to come move to, and erased all of the great work that had already been done in communities. So, it takes a lot, getting back to the theme of trust, we don't always have the best track record in some of our neighborhoods as the government. And I think really taking the time to respect and get to know the existing leaders within that community, and building off all of the work that they've already done and supporting their capacity to continue doing the work in the future, I think is really important.
Very similar to what the panelists have said so far, something that I think as the emerging professional is that I had to kind of learn, and I'm still learning, is, and this actually kind of goes back to your empathy question, is the fact that that isn't enough to kind of level as far as how you're gonna get process to go about, and having to make business cases or having to make these work plans and having to have it to structure it in such a way that sometimes misses the point when you consider, like the stuff that you're saying, Patrice, when you consider how the impacts, how the impacts historically have left this kind of communal trauma, and also similarly with the pace, thinking that this is something that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time, and having to translate that into something that becomes a work plan, or translate that into something that becomes a negotiation or something. I think that's something that I'm still trying to figure out how to do that tactfully.
Just started a book by Thomas Friedman called Thank You for Being Late, and he quotes this other guy, and it's this quote that stuck with me all week, and he says, when you press pause on a machine, it stops, but when you press pause on a human, it starts. Mm-hmm. And in terms of time, right, I think that one of the things maybe that we take away from tonight is this idea of pause, this time of reflection, like let's create space and moments in our process where we can actually think about this stuff, right? And we can then begin to act on it with good thinking first, right? I think we fetishize action and like that's the thing. God, we had to right now. But let's think. Let's take a pause. Let's take a moment. Let's give ourselves time, and then understand that you are going to need time to do this work effectively, right? So I've got one more question. Patrice, is for you specifically, and before I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to turn the slide, and on the next slide is a link to a website with a code, and this is our question platform. So you'll go to the URL and type in the event code, and that will allow you on your smartphone to be able to submit a question. And then we'll be able to cull those questions, and we won't be able to get to all of them probably, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. My last question for you, Patrice, is you yesterday said something about the relationship between privilege and language. And I would love for you to kind of expand a little bit on that for us here who, by the very nature of being here, probably have some position of privilege. And if you could speak to that, I think that would be, as a last kind of closing note, I think would be really great.
At the heart, at the core of what brings me joy in doing this work is workforce development, right? So I'll just lead with that. Like I myself am a product of the Rainier Beach neighborhood threading some notion of workforce development. So I think about language and privilege from two perspectives. One, when you come from a disciplinary perspective, a sector, right, and specifically to this we're speaking to, and we're engaging community, the first thing is language, right? And so not only are you coming in with your bucket of words that you yourself have been trained up on in order to be able to communicate effectively with your colleagues and those that are in proximity to the work that you're doing to get it done, But when you come into community or with folks who don't have the same formal training, that is the first impediment. And it's hard when you're steeped in the training to catch yourself, right? Because you find you have to check yourself at the line of, somebody will say, I had to dumb it down, like give it to me in layman's terms, right? And that, I think, is the point where you say, am I entering into a conversation or am I entering into a proposal, right? And when it's a conversation, all the formal training stuff falls to the wayside if you truly are showing up in that space authentically. The other piece is legit workforce development, right? So when we have opportunities to bring people alongside us and or follow people in the process, how are we being intentional about every moment that is a moment to have some cross-pollination with regard to knowledge that's being shared either about a place, a building, a thing, or whatever, that those moments are elevated. And I personally am still working on how do we do that, right? How do we do that in a random moment, sitting at a bus stop, hopefully not on these chairs that I feel discriminated against sitting in them because I don't have a strong core, so I'm struggling right now. You know, so when you have a moment, and any moment is a learned moment, right? How are we intentionally being cross-poly when it comes to the knowledge we may have about that space? But two, going back to like structural change, right? We know that often the curriculum, the training, the immersion that we get is the very thing that has tread upon folks. And so how are we bending ourselves to that when engaging with others who don't have the formal training and trying to bring some of that into the practice at whatever level you may be. And that probably is much more wordy than I intended it to be. But yeah, that's it.
You know, we were talking about belonging and who's belonging for who and things of that sort. Can you speak just briefly to the relationship between the beauty of a place and sense of self for those who are there?
Yeah, and this question is definitely feels very personal, and you know, I was talking when I spoke at the very beginning in my introduction that I was talking about, you know, this idea of a Black affirming public space. And growing up, for example, my conception of Blackness came through a Latin American context. Both of my parents are Colombian. My dad is from the Pacific coast of Colombia, which is predominantly Afro-Colombian. And learning kind of my identity through that context felt very familiar. And then there's this shift that happens, a geographic shift, a cultural shift, where you still have community that looks and kind of feels like you, but there's parts of you and parts of them that don't fully, you know, you don't fully know it yet, and you're still trying to learn that. And I think that there's something really, really beautiful and really powerful when you have the ability to create representation in space or have a space that represents you, or even just to kind of figure that out for yourself. And I think that that is like the most kind of humbling connection, place attachment, belonging feeling that like I can even think of or describe. So I think that that makes something incredibly beautiful, and the way that the space is designed or the way that the environment is kind of set out really ultimately boils down to what allowances, and you spoke to it too, like what allowances are or what affordances are happening in that space for people to kind of make meaning for themselves and just kind of figure themselves and each other out. And I think that's like really getting at the core, at least for me, as far as belonging.
Are you planning, it looks like it's probably for the Rainier Beach Action Coalition, are you planning to work with SBS and the RBHS staff, students, and community to help fold the high school into the Henderson Corridor overall vision?
Most of the young people that we hire attend Rainier Beach High School, so we've mentored young people through their International Baccalaureate program, so we have a intimate relationship with them. The one thing that we're going to need to do is have the Seattle Public Schools recognize that they are in a neighborhood. Yeah. Now, as it turns out, in Rainier Beach, the Seattle Public Schools owns most of the real estate because there's like 4 schools in Rainier Beach neighborhood. But the leaders in the building, surely the leaders at the district, because it is such an expanse geography that they exist in, don't often recognize that they are in fact, in neighborhoods. And so we would assume that we tell them, have you read the neighborhood plan? You know, probably not. We talk about the implications of a construction on other parts of the neighborhood. One of the things that we learned is that principals and educators tend not to value transportation to the level a neighborhood does. And we have to bring it to them. We have to say, well, this is how your students come. This is how your teachers come. This is how your parents come. You need to expand your mission just 5% to add this other contextual factor in there. So our hope is that we are. Our students have cited it. We have a number of different initiatives in the building that suggest that our perspectives need to be seen, particularly around food justice. Some of the young people that are with us were at Rainier Beach and they started their raised beds. And so is the design going to include the ability to grow produce in the school? So we hope so. And if not, then we know the places that we can go to try to enforce the need that they need to take our perspective on. But you can kind of count on it, and that's kind of where the watchdog thing comes in. So, yeah.
With all the rapid development in the city, how can we create community and public space and take our time doing so? I think this is an anonymous question. If you want to speak more to this, you can. What I'm kind of picking up in this is we talked about time, we talked about taking time, but then there's this sense of urgency, right? And we're like, well, actually, but we have people who can't wait. So how do we in non-dualistic ways reconcile that tension and lean into it effectively?
I think that some of the projects like the one that Casey is doing speak really well to this, in that there's work that can be done incrementally. There are all these painting projects being done, transforming streetscapes that give communities that need the change open space quickly. But it doesn't have to be a huge capital project that's getting sort of slammed through a community. It can be something simpler at first and can evolve later. And I think that question of time and kind of keeping up with the city, it's gonna keep changing. The issues are gonna have evolved 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And so I do think that that's something we have to be aware of as designers in general, is that we need to be designing spaces that are flexible enough that they can accommodate future change as needed.
I think there's a couple nuances, and thank you for qualifying your question. So for the work that we do, and specifically from the city's perspective, when it comes to the Equitable Development Initiative, you have different neighborhoods that vary on a displacement risk scale, right? And so you can have a neighborhood that has high risk displacement, low access to opportunity, and up against a neighborhood that has high risk, high opportunity, low risk of displacement, and the ability for both of those neighborhoods to advocate for their authenticity or to protect their identity or their diversity is going to vastly vary, right? Your ability to organize, your ability to be present, your ability to have resources, your proximity to political will and power, your historic muscle when it comes to having built your political will and power, resources, and that could be anything from pro bono law advice to legit money, right? And so that question, I think, is a hard one, and the answers vary depending upon what neighborhood you are in. Displacement.
That's a good question. It's a tough one, very, very tough, because it's bringing to mind a conversation I had with young people about the development of one of these spaces. And it went something like this. Okay, so we're being asked to come up with ideas for what this should look like. Yeah. And based on the social, geographic, demographic trends that are happening, we are not going to be here to realize the benefit of the ideas that we have put into this.
And they make it actually, they increase the value by doing this.
Yeah, and so what they said was, so let's make it so that they don't want to come to it. Let's design it so that white folk won't come, won't want to be there. And I had to say, no. Let's design it so that the people that you want to be there will come to it. But the point is the tension that's existing in that question, in the minds of our young people who are being asked to speak into things. And now they're seeing the trend and the reality, and they want to stop it. And so they say, well, let's design it so they won't come. And I don't know what that would look like, for one. But the other was, well, yeah, let's just make it and design it and speak into it so that we can be there more than we probably typically would. So thank you for the question, because it is a very tough tension that's existing in the minds of our young people.
For me, definitely. And I think some of the projects that I think are most successful I've worked on have surprised me. It's sort of when they take on a life of their own, and when groups of people who, broader groups of people are there. I have a project in Houston, for example, that different communities started driving to, that we never expected it to attract, as kind of a broad cross-section of Houston as it did, and that was really fun to see. But it's when they take on their own life, and people are using space and enjoying space and making it their own, beyond what we imagined as designers, and it's still successful. That's really exciting to see.
I think I would just sort of piggyback on the last thing that you were saying, and to me, there are a lot of really complex challenges, and I don't think any of us really have the answer to them. And so for me, it's doing my best to make sure that this work can support our communities to thrive in place, thrive where they are, and is not contributing to the existing displacement pressures within those neighborhoods, is not another tool for gentrification. And that's not something that we can guarantee, but we can do everything we can. We can bring out every tool we have, and think really hard about our processes and how we're doing our work, from everything from workforce development to career pathways to thinking about affordable housing adjacent to, and community land trusts adjacent to some of these park developments, to do everything we can to try to make sure that communities are able to benefit from these improvements rather than be displaced by them.
So I came back to Rainier Beach Action Coalition after being founder, volunteer after 12 years, until I was able to, about 20 months ago, work full-time and be managing strategist. So one of the responses is we made sure that we integrated what success looks like in our tagline. Right? So when we say neighborhood engagement, neighborhood empowerment. So so we can quantify that. There's about 10,000 people in the neighborhood, so if we can get 10% of them engaged, then we know that. But then the other is empowered, and that comes to be defined generally by kind of policy wins that we might have as a result of that engagement. And so I spoke about the Orca cards. I spoke about the priority hire. I didn't speak about the change that we created around the transit-oriented development of the light rail station to change the zoning codes. And we actually created a Seattle mix designation. And this is when the mandatory housing affordability work was kind of going, and we wanted a one-size-fits-all. And we're like, no, we need community benefit on the ground floor. So that this is to have folks engaged and empowered to be able to articulate that to the city, and then to get that designation. And so now you will not get the height that you desire unless you have community benefit on the ground floor. So what do we mean community benefit? We're talking about community-based organization space, early childhood development centers, gathering spaces for residents. So putting it into the tagline helps make it easier to kind of, be able to speak to it when you know it when you see it. So that was just some tactic that we kind of used to help us identify what success looks like.
You have my heartfelt thanks. Thank you so much for showing up and the time that you put into not only preparing, but the time you've invested in our communities through the work that you're doing. So thank you. Yeah.